The city harbor glowed against the night sky, its reflection shimmering across the dark water like scattered diamonds. Along the riverside, where the financial district met the old port, stood a restaurant that had become the evening refuge of executives and investors. Riverside, white tablecloths, soft jazz, and the kind of clientele that spoke in hushed tones about mergers and acquisitions. It was the sort of place where deals were sealed over wine, where power moved quietly beneath the surface of polite conversation. Henry Walker moved between tables with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to become invisible. At 35, he carried himself with a quiet dignity that most people missed. They saw the uniform, the tray, the automatic smile. They did not see the former IT technician, the single father working the evening shift so he could be there when his 7-year-old daughter Audrey woke each morning. They did not see the man who still kept lint-free cloths in his apron pocket, a habit from his old life troubleshooting hardware emergencies for a telecommunications company. That life had ended 3 years ago, when his wife lost her battle with illness, and Henry found himself navigating a world that suddenly felt too large and too complicated. Now, his world had shrunk to manageable dimensions. Work, home, Audrey, the speech therapy sessions that would help her overcome the slight stammer that emerged whenever she felt nervous or excited. Everything else was noise. But tonight, as Henry navigated the dinner rush, fragments of conversation drifted past him like smoke. Aurora, the word kept surfacing at different tables, always spoken with a particular inflection, as if it carried weight beyond its syllables. He had heard it enough times in recent weeks to know it was more than just talk. Sterling Capital, the investment firm that seemed to own half the Riverside development projects, was apparently on the verge of closing some kind of technology deal. The rumors varied. Some said it was a data initiative. Others whispered about educational funding. Henry had learned not to pay too much attention. In, end, end, end. Rich people's problems rarely touched his life in any meaningful way. Alexandra Sterling sat at her usual corner table, laptop open, her attention fixed on the screen with an intensity that created a subtle force field around her. At 34, she had built Sterling Capital from a regional player into a national force, earning herself the nickname, the Ice Queen, in financial circles. It was not affection that generated the title. Alexandra was known for her decisiveness, her secrecy, her unwillingness to show weakness. The board respected her, investors trusted her, competitors feared her. But tonight, beneath that carefully maintained composure, something was fracturing. The laptop screen glowed with documents she had reviewed a dozen times. Aurora, her initiative. A data commons project designed to support educational access for underserved children. It was personal in ways she could not fully articulate. Rooted in memories of growing up watching her own mother struggle to navigate systems designed to exclude people like them. But the board was restless. Clinton Pierce, her chief financial officer, had been making subtle suggestions about timing, about market conditions, about the wisdom of moving forward without more internal alignment. He was 48, silver-haired, and possessed the kind of smooth competence that made him dangerous. He never openly opposed her. He simply raised questions, planted doubts, positioned himself as the voice of prudent caution. Alexandra's phone buzzed. Another message. Anonymous. The third this week. She glimpsed the preview before the screen locked itself. We know what Aurora really is. Her jaw tightened. She reached for the laptop lid, a reflexive movement born from months of increasing paranoia. Who had access to her communications? Who was tracking the project? The questions circled endlessly, finding no answers. Henry approached the table, balancing a fresh cup of coffee. He had adjusted his path slightly. A habit from his IT days, when he learned to position himself to catch error messages before users closed them. Not snooping. Exactly. Just observing. As he leaned forward to place the cup, he caught a glimpse of the screen. File directories. One folder labeled Aurora in capital letters, and then the phone buzzed again, that sharp ping of an incoming message, and Alexandra's hand jerked toward the device. The movement was sudden, automatic, and Henry felt his own grip falter. The coffee cup tilted. Time seemed to slow as the dark liquid arced through the air and splashed across the keyboard, spreading in a bloom of brown across the silver metal. The restaurant noise evaporated. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Heads turned. Alexandra stared at the ruined laptop, her face draining of color. But she did not yell. She did not snap. She simply froze, her eyes fixed on the screen as if she had just seen something terrible revealed in the wet glow. Henry immediately began apologizing, pulling the lint-free cloth from his pocket, carefully tilting the laptop to drain the liquid away from the motherboard. Old instincts took over. Never let moisture sit on circuits. Act fast. As he worked, his eyes caught something unusual beneath the laptop. A thin NFC tag, aftermarket, adhered to the bottom casing. Not standard equipment. The kind of hardware used for security keys or tracking devices. His pulse quickened, but he kept his expression neutral, focused on the cleanup. Alexandra finally spoke, her voice tight and controlled. She needed the device taken to her security team immediately. Not to customer service, not to a repair shop, to Elias Grant, her head of information security. She pulled out her phone, made a quick call. Her back turned slightly to Henry, as if shielding the conversation. When she ended the call and looked back at him, her expression had shifted. Not angry, wary, calculating, as if she was reassessing who this waiter might be and what he might have seen. Finn Coleman, the restaurant manager, materialized at the table, his face flushed with the kind of panic that comes from watching a very important client experience a service disaster. He began a stream of apologies, assuring Alexandra that of course the meal would be complimentary, that he would personally oversee anything she needed, that this was absolutely unacceptable. Alexandra waved him off with barely concealed impatience. She was not interested in apologies. She settled her bill without complaint, left a tip that was neither generous nor stingy, and departed with the damaged laptop clutched under her arm. But before she left, her eyes met Henry's for just a moment, and in that glance was a question. "Who are you?" After she was gone, Finn pulled Henry aside, his voice low and urgent. "Stay away from the VIP tables. Do not approach that section again, unless specifically asked." The message was clear. Henry had become a liability. He nodded, returned to his other tables, but his mind was elsewhere. The NFC tag. Alexandra's reaction. The way she had prioritized closing the laptop over saving the hardware. People do not behave that way unless they are protecting something. Or unless they are afraid. That night, after his shift ended and he returned to the small apartment he shared with Audrey, Henry found himself staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Aurora. The name kept circling through his thoughts. He pulled out his phone and did what any former IT professional would do. He started searching. Public records, news articles, business filings. Nothing illegal. Nothing that required access to restricted systems. Just the open web, the vast landscape of information that people assumed was private but was actually scattered across 1,000 databases and forgotten social media posts. He found references to Vanessa Holdings, a shell company with vague ties to educational technology initiatives. Aurora appeared in leaked contract metadata, always in connection with data aggregation and child welfare programs. On the surface, it looked legitimate. Philanthropic, even. But the anonymity surrounding Vanessa, the layers of corporate structure designed to obscure ownership, suggested something more complicated. Henry made notes, careful to keep everything documented. If this went anywhere, he would need a clean chain of evidence. He had no intention of breaking laws. He had Audrey to think about. But he also had a growing sense that something was very wrong and that his accidental involvement had opened a door he could not simply close. Alexandra, meanwhile, was discovering her own set of problems. Elias Grant examined the laptop in his secure lab, running diagnostics that revealed what Alexandra had already suspected. The NFC tag was a hardware backdoor, a sophisticated piece of surveillance tech that allowed remote access to the device. It had been physically installed, which meant someone with direct access to her equipment had placed it there. Not a remote hack. An inside job. The revelation sent a chill through her. Who on her team had betrayed her? And more importantly, what had they already seen? Elias was 31, brilliant in that particular way that made him simultaneously invaluable and socially awkward. He had genuine respect for Alexandra, not because she was the CEO, but because she actually understood technology and did not treat security as an inconvenience. Now, as he showed her the forensics report, his concern was evident. They needed to review everyone who had physical access to executive equipment. The list was uncomfortably short and uncomfortably familiar. IT support staff. The facilities team, responsible for maintenance. And Oliver Brooks, the head of building security, whose protocols governed how and when executive devices could be serviced. Clinton Pierce, when informed of the security breach, responded with exactly the kind of measured concern that made Alexandra's instincts prickle. He suggested pausing the Aurora rollout until they could ensure complete system integrity. On the surface, it was a reasonable recommendation. But Alexandra heard the subtext. Clinton was using her vulnerability to slow a project he had never fully supported. The board, already nervous about Aurora's scope and cost, would seize any excuse to demand delays. And delays, in the world of high-stakes finance, often became cancellations. Clinton also made a point of speaking privately with Oliver Brooks about equipment maintenance protocols. Alexandra was not present for that conversation, but she noted its occurrence. Two men with authority over physical access to her devices conferring in the wake of a discovered breach. She filed the observation away, adding it to the growing list of data points that did not quite form a pattern but suggested one lurking just beneath the surface. Henry's life continued its normal rhythm. Work. Home. Audrey's therapy sessions, where she practiced her breathing exercises and learned to slow down when words wanted to tumble over each other. But beneath that normalcy, something had shifted. He found himself researching Aurora in stolen moments, cross-referencing corporate filings, mapping relationships between shell companies and board members. It was harmless, he told himself. Public information, no different than reading the news, except that it felt like picking at a scab, revealing something raw underneath. And then the message arrived. Anonymous. Untraceable. A single photograph of Audrey in her school playground, taken from a distance with a long lens. The angle was wrong. Shot from outside the fence at a height that suggested someone had been standing on the street corner watching. Below the image, 2 words. Stop looking. Henry's hand shook as he stared at the screen. This was not theoretical anymore. This was not some abstract puzzle about corporate malfeasance. This was his daughter. This was the one thing in his world that mattered more than truth, more than justice, more than anything. Fear crashed over him, primal and overwhelming. He wanted to delete everything, destroy his notes. Pretend he had never noticed the NFC tag, never searched for Aurora, never allowed his curiosity to pull him into waters far deeper and more dangerous than he had imagined. But then he thought about what it meant that someone had photographed his daughter. Someone knew where she went to school. Someone was watching, and the only reason they would watch was if Henry had stumbled onto something that mattered, something worth protecting through intimidation. He could stop now, retreat into silence, and hope that would be enough. Or he could acknowledge that the door had already been opened, that simply walking away might not guarantee safety. He made a decision that felt simultaneously reckless and necessary. He reached out to Alexandra Sterling, not through official channels, not through the restaurant. He found her company's main line and left a message with her executive assistant. Brief and cryptic. This is Henry Walker, from Riverside. I need to speak with you about what happened. It's urgent. He did not expect a response. CEOs do not take meetings with waiters, especially waiters they associate with ruined laptops. But within 2 hours, his phone rang with an unknown number, and Alexandra's voice was on the other end. Controlled, but curious. What could not wait? Henry told her about the threat, about the photograph of Audrey, about his suspicion that his accidental glimpse of her screen had made him a target. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Alexandra said something that changed everything. "I've been threatened too." They met the next evening in a coffee shop, 3 neighborhoods away from both Riverside and Sterling Capital's offices, a neutral space where neither of them would be recognized. Alexandra arrived first, sitting in a back corner with a clear view of the door. When Henry entered with Audrey in tow, the little girl holding tightly to her father's hand, Alexandra's expression softened in a way that surprised her. She had expected to meet a potential threat, someone fishing for leverage or angling for a payout. Instead, she saw a frightened parent trying to protect his child. They spoke carefully, circling the topic, testing each other's trustworthiness. Audrey colored at the table, her concentration absolute, occasionally showing her father a completed page with shy pride. Alexandra watched the interaction and made a decision that went against every instinct her years in finance had cultivated. She chose to trust this stranger. Not completely, not blindly, but enough to share that she too had received threats, that someone inside or close to her organization was undermining Aurora, and that the coffee incident might not have been entirely accidental from the universe's perspective. "Sometimes," Alexandra said quietly, "the world forces connections we would never choose on our own." Elias Grant became their unlikely ally. When Alexandra brought Henry into the secure lab, explaining his background in IT and his inadvertent discovery of the NFC tag, Elias accepted the situation with the pragmatism of someone who cared more about solving problems than maintaining corporate hierarchies. Together, they began mapping the breach. Access logs showed unusual patterns. Oliver Brooks had been on floors, and at times that did not match his official schedule. VPN connections to the Aurora files originated from internal addresses at odd hours. Someone was using cloned credentials, piggybacking on legitimate access to mask unauthorized surveillance. Henry contributed his own observations from the restaurant. Clinton Pierce maintained rigorous patterns. He ate lunch at Riverside every Thursday at the same table, ordering the same meal, keeping the same schedule. Habits were vulnerabilities. Predictable behavior created opportunities for tracking, for planting devices, for establishing patterns of surveillance. Henry suggested something that made Alexandra raise an eyebrow. He could place a tracking beacon on Clinton's briefcase. Nothing illegal, just a commercial GPS tracker designed for people to keep tabs on their luggage. They would know where Clinton went, who he met, whether his movements aligned with his official calendar. It was a risk, but it was also something Henry could accomplish without raising suspicion. After all, he was just a waiter. Invisible. The plan came together over several days. Elias created a honeypot, a fake version of the Aurora database, filled with realistic but ultimately traceable data. Every file was watermarked with digital fingerprints that would log any device that accessed them and phone home with identifying information. Alexandra signed off on the scheme, despite the risk. If Clinton or Oliver took the bait, they would have concrete evidence. If they did not, at least the real Aurora files would remain secure behind additional layers of encryption. Henry waited for the right moment. Thursday lunch service. Clinton Pierce at his usual table, briefcase on the floor beside his chair. The tracking device was smaller than a deck of cards, adhesive backing ready. Henry simply needed a reason to be near the briefcase long enough to attach it. He created the opportunity by deliberately fumbling a water refill at the adjacent table, apologizing profusely as he cleaned up the minor spill, his body positioned to block Clinton's view. It took 3 seconds to press the beacon onto the underside of the briefcase's leather bottom. 3 seconds that felt like an eternity. When he straightened, Clinton was still focused on his phone, oblivious. Henry retreated, pulse hammering, aware that he had just crossed a line from observer to participant. The beacon began transmitting its location. For several days, the data was unremarkable. Clinton's office, his home in the suburbs, Riverside for lunch. But then, late one evening, the tracker showed movement to an industrial area near the waterfront. An old warehouse district that had been slated for redevelopment, but remained largely abandoned. Clinton stayed there for 40 minutes, then departed. The next night, he returned. And this time, the beacon showed a second vehicle arriving separately. Based on the timing and location, Elias cross-referenced building security logs. Oliver Brooks had signed out for a personal errand at the same time. 2 senior members of Sterling Capital meeting in a derelict warehouse at night. Not illegal exactly, but certainly suspicious. And then, the media bomb detonated. An anonymous tip to a financial news outlet claimed that Alexandra Sterling was using child welfare data from the Aurora project for unauthorized purposes, potentially violating privacy regulations and betraying the trust of vulnerable families. The story went viral within hours. Stock prices for Sterling Capital plummeted. Investors panicked. The board called an emergency meeting. And in that meeting, Clinton Pierce made his move. He expressed deep concern for the company's reputation, suggested that perhaps Alexandra should step aside temporarily while an independent investigation cleared the air, positioned himself as the steady hand that could guide Sterling Capital through the crisis. It was a coup disguised as concern. And it was working. Henry, watching the news from his apartment, felt sick. This was escalating beyond anything he had imagined. Audrey sat beside him, her coloring book open, oblivious to the storm unfolding on the screen. His phone buzzed. Alexandra. Her voice was strained when he answered. "They're suspending me. Clinton is taking over as interim CEO. I need you to know that this is not over. They're trying to bury Aurora and destroy me in the process. But we still have the honeypot. If they access it, we'll have them." The next blow landed the following morning. Oliver Brooks produced evidence that Henry Walker, a restaurant employee with no business being in Sterling Capital's secure facility, had been granted access to the building. More damning, a lint-free cloth found in the IT lab bore Henry's fingerprints and coffee stains matching the spill incident. The implication was clear. Henry had sabotaged Alexandra's laptop deliberately. Planted evidence. Perhaps was even the source of the anonymous media tips. Finn Coleman, under pressure to distance Riverside from the scandal, suspended Henry indefinitely. The message was unambiguous. Henry was being framed as the fall guy, the convenient outsider to blame for an inside job. Alexandra did not abandon him. Instead, she did something that defied every calculation of political self-interest. She went to Henry's apartment, met him and Audrey in person, and looked him in the eye. "I trust you." Those 3 words, delivered with quiet certainty, meant more to Henry than any legal defense could have. They sat at his small kitchen table while Audrey showed Alexandra her drawings, and Alexandra asked questions with genuine interest, not the performative attention adults often give children. In that moment, the CEO and the waiter found common ground in the only currency that mattered. They both knew what it meant to protect someone vulnerable. For Henry, it was Audrey. For Alexandra, it was Aurora, and the children the project was meant to serve. They reviewed everything they knew: the NFC breach, the threatening messages, Clinton's warehouse meetings, the honeypot waiting to be sprung. Elias had fine-tuned the trap. The moment anyone accessed the fake Aurora database, it would not only log their device but also transmit a location ping. If Clinton and Oliver were working together, if they had server equipment at the warehouse for extracting or manipulating data, the honeypot would reveal it. But they needed more than digital evidence. They needed to catch them in the act. And that meant going to the warehouse themselves. Zane Bennett entered the picture at exactly the right moment. He was a federal financial investigator who had been quietly tracking Vanessa Holdings for months, following a thread of suspicious transactions that suggested money laundering and data brokerage. When Alexandra and Elias approached him with their evidence, he saw the opportunity to connect his investigation to their corporate espionage case. Bennett was 40, methodical, and possessed the kind of patient intensity that came from years of building cases one document at a time. He agreed to provide backup, but only if they could deliver solid evidence of criminal activity. No speculation, no corporate politics, just clean proof that would stand up in court. They planned the operation carefully. Elias would monitor the honeypot from a remote location. When it was accessed, he would trigger the location ping and alert Bennett's team. Alexandra, Henry, and Bennett would position themselves near the warehouse, ready to intervene once they had confirmation. It was dangerous. It was probably unwise. But it was also the only way to force the truth into the light before Clinton consolidated his control over Sterling Capital and buried Aurora permanently. The night was stormy. Rain coming down in heavy sheets that turned the warehouse district into a landscape of blurred sodium lights and slick pavement. Henry sat in Bennett's unmarked car. Audrey beside him buckled into the back seat. He had tried to leave her with a neighbor, but she had looked at him with those wide, trusting eyes and asked if he was going to be okay. He could not lie to her. So he told her he was trying to help someone, that it might be a little scary, but that Agent Bennett would keep them safe. Audrey had solemnly produced her small flashlight, the one she used for reading under her covers after bedtime, and announced that she could help by signaling if something was wrong. Henry had not had the heart to say no. Inside the warehouse, Clinton Pierce worked with quiet efficiency. Oliver Brooks stood guard near the entrance, alert for any unexpected visitors. Between them sat a compact server unit, its fans whirring softly in the cavernous space. Clinton inserted a drive, began accessing files he believed were the real Aurora database. He was confident, even relaxed. Alexandra had been neutralized. The board was compliant. Oliver controlled physical security. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. What he did not know was that every keystroke was being logged. Every access attempt was creating an indelible record, and the data he was so carefully downloading was bait. The ping reached Elias first. Then Bennett's phone buzzed with confirmation. The trap had been sprung. Bennett radioed his backup team, positioned 2 blocks away. Then he looked at Henry and Alexandra. It's time. They moved through the rain, approaching the warehouse from different angles. Alexandra went directly to the main entrance, walking with the kind of confidence that made her impossible to ignore. She pushed open the door and stood silhouetted against the rainy night, water dripping from her coat, her voice cutting through the empty space. "Looking for something, Clinton?" Clinton turned, surprise flickering across his face, before settling into a cold smile. "I thought you were busy with your suspension. What brings you to this part of town?" Alexandra stepped inside, water pooling at her feet. "You're stealing Aurora. Not the data. The fear. You've been threatening me, threatening people around me, trying to make me desperate enough to abandon the project so you can buy it out through Vanessa Holdings. Then you'll flip it. Sell the data to the highest bidder. Child welfare information, educational records. Everything we promised to protect. That's your play, isn't it?" Clinton's smile widened. "The problem with idealists, Alexandra, is that you think everyone shares your sentiments. Aurora is valuable precisely because of what it contains. Do you know what advertisers will pay for granular data on children's behavior and family economics? What political campaigns would spend to micro-target educational messaging? You are going to give it away. I'm going to monetize it. That's not betrayal. That's business." Oliver moved toward the door, but Henry stepped into his path, blocking the exit. Oliver's hand went to his belt, but then the warehouse flooded with light. Federal agents poured through multiple entrances, weapons drawn, voices commanding everyone to freeze. Bennett entered last, his badge visible, his expression calm. "Clinton Pierce, Oliver Brooks, you're both under arrest. We have evidence of corporate espionage, data theft, and conspiracy to commit wire fraud." And in the center of the space, Audrey stood, holding her flashlight, its beam steady and bright, aimed at Clinton like a tiny lighthouse warning ships away from rocks. She had signaled the agents exactly as she and her father had practiced. The adults had their evidence, but Audrey had her own kind of courage. And in that moment, she was part of the team that brought everything down. The arrests were swift and thorough. Clinton's server was seized, its contents cataloged. The trail of access attempts led back to clone credentials Oliver had manufactured. The location data from Henry's beacon corroborated their presence at the warehouse. The honeypot files Elias had created provided the technical proof of intent. Every piece fit together into a narrative that even the most skeptical prosecutor could not dismiss. Clinton and Oliver were remanded to federal custody. Bail denied, given the flight risk and the severity of the charges. Within 48 hours, Sterling Capital's board held another emergency meeting. This time, the outcome was different. Alexandra was reinstated immediately, with full authority and a formal apology for the premature action taken during the crisis. Vivian Constance, the company's public relations director, orchestrated a press conference that reframed the entire narrative. Sterling Capital had been the victim of an elaborate internal conspiracy, but thanks to the vigilance of its CEO and the brave assistance of ordinary citizens, the plot had been exposed. The emphasis on ordinary citizens was deliberate. Henry's role was acknowledged without identifying him directly, protecting his privacy and Audrey's safety while still giving him credit. Elias Grant was promoted to Chief Information Security Officer, a new role created specifically to overhaul Sterling Capital's entire security infrastructure. His first initiative was to eliminate any equipment maintenance protocols that allowed unsupervised access to executive devices. New procedures required two-person teams, video documentation, and tamper-evident seals on all hardware. The NFC breach would not happen again. Henry's suspension from Riverside was quietly reversed. Finn Coleman apologized personally, admitted that he had acted out of fear rather than principle, and told Henry that his job would be waiting whenever he wanted to return. But Henry did not immediately go back. Instead, Alexandra made him an offer that solved multiple problems at once. Sterling Capital needed someone who understood both technology and human behavior, someone who could spot anomalies and think outside corporate hierarchies. She created a position for him: incident response specialist, flexible hours, a salary that would more than cover Audrey's therapy, and then some. Henry would work on call, consulting on security issues, reviewing procedures, bringing the perspective of someone who had seen the company from the outside. It was not charity. It was recognition of his value. The frozen educational fund that had been blocking Audrey's speech therapy mysteriously unlocked. Someone at Sterling Capital had made a few phone calls to the right people. Alexandra never took credit. But Henry knew. He also knew that Aurora was being restructured with new oversight, independent auditors, and transparent protocols that would prevent it from ever becoming the data mining operation Clinton had envisioned. The project would launch, but it would launch right, with protections, with accountability, with the idealism that Alexandra had fought to preserve. Several weeks later, on a clear evening, when the city lights painted the river with streaks of gold and silver, 3 people stood on the pedestrian bridge that connected the financial district to the old residential neighborhoods. Henry held a cup of coffee in one hand, Audrey's hand in the other. Alexandra stood beside them, her usual armor of professional distance softened by something that might have been contentment, or relief, or the beginning of trust that went beyond crisis cooperation. Audrey tugged on Henry's sleeve, pointing at the water. "The lights are dancing," she said, her words clear and unpunctuated by the stammer that used to break them apart. Henry looked down at his daughter and felt a swell of pride so intense it was almost painful. She had been scared that night at the warehouse. But she had been brave too, and in being brave, she had started to shed the fear that had once tangled her tongue. Alexandra knelt down, bringing herself level with Audrey. "You know what you did that night?" she said quietly. "You helped keep people safe, including me. That flashlight of yours was perfect." Audrey beamed, pulling the small light from her pocket and clicking it on and off in a proud demonstration. "It's my signal," she explained. "For when things are important." Henry met Alexandra's eyes over his daughter's head. The understanding that passed between them needed no words. They had started as strangers, connected by accident and desperation. Now, they were something else. Not quite friends, though friendship was growing. Not quite colleagues, though they worked together. And not quite a family, though Audrey had started asking when Miss Alexandra would visit again. What they were was uncertain, undefined, still forming. But it was built on something solid, trust earned in fire, competence recognized under pressure, decency proven when it would have been easier to look away. Henry raised his coffee cup in a small salute. This time, he said with a slight smile, "I'll make sure to keep this away from your electronics." Alexandra laughed, a genuine sound that surprised her. "I'll hold you to that. Though honestly, I'm starting to think that spill was the best accident that ever happened to me." She paused, then added more quietly, "You could have walked away. Most people would have." Henry shrugged. "Most people don't have someone threaten their kid. That changes the calculation." Alexandra nodded. "It does. But you still chose to do the right thing. Not just the safe thing. That matters." They stood together as the city moved around them, as the river flowed beneath, as the night gathered its shadows. Audrey practiced her flashlight signals, creating patterns of light against the growing darkness. Henry watched his daughter and allowed himself to feel something he had not felt in years. Hope. Not the desperate kind born from wishing things were different, but the steady kind built on evidence that life could surprise you, that strangers could become allies, that a single moment of attention could change everything. The lint-free cloth that had once been evidence of sabotage now sat in Henry's desk drawer at home, cleaned and folded. A reminder of where this strange journey had begun. The flashlight that Audrey carried became her most prized possession, not because it was expensive or special, but because she had used it when it counted. And the coffee, which had started everything, became a ritual. Every few days, Henry would stop by Sterling Capital with 2 cups from a shop that Alexandra preferred, and they would sit in her office discussing security protocols or company culture, or sometimes just the weather. The professional boundary remained, but within it, something warmer grew. It was not a love story, or at least not yet. It was something more fundamental. A recognition that in a world that often felt hostile and precarious, there were still people worth trusting. That courage came in different forms, from CEOs defying their boards to waiters, risking their livelihoods to 7-year-old girls standing in warehouses with flashlights. That accidents were sometimes the universe's way of forcing necessary connections, and that sometimes, when you stopped running from complications and instead faced them alongside someone else, you discovered that you were not as alone as you had believed. The ending was not neat. Clinton Pierce and Oliver Brooks faced years of legal battles, their reputations destroyed but their defense teams formidable. Vanessa Holdings was being dismantled by federal investigators, but the web of corruption it had spun extended into places that would take time to fully unravel. Aurora launched in a limited pilot program, successful but cautious, watched by skeptics and supporters alike. Henry still worked some shifts at Riverside, unwilling to fully sever the identity he had built there, and Audrey continued her therapy, her speech improving steadily, her confidence building with every word she mastered. But on that bridge, with the city glowing and the river flowing and the night full of possibility, those complications felt manageable. The 3 of them stood together, not as a family yet, but as people who had survived something difficult and come out changed. Henry glanced at Alexandra and saw not the ice queen of corporate legend, but a woman who had chosen principle over convenience, who had risked everything to protect an ideal. Alexandra looked at Henry and saw not a waiter, but a man who had demonstrated more integrity in a crisis than most executives showed in a career. And Audrey, clicking her flashlight and happy patterns, saw 2 adults who had included her in something important, who had trusted her to be brave. The coffee in Henry's hand had long since gone cold, but he did not care. This was not about coffee anymore. It was about the moment after the accident, the choice to stay rather than flee, the decision to trust despite every rational reason not to. It was about lint-free cloths and flashlights, and the small, unremarkable tools that became symbols of something larger. It was about the fact that sometimes the universe breaks things deliberately, not to destroy them, but to reveal what they are actually made of. They would figure out the rest as they went. The romantic tension that was beginning to hum beneath their conversations would either resolve or remain potential energy. Henry and Audrey would settle into their new life, one with more stability and less fear. Alexandra would rebuild Sterling Capital into something stronger and more ethical. And Aurora would grow, carefully and transparently, into the project it was always meant to be. But none of that needed to be decided tonight. Tonight was simply about standing together on a bridge, watching a city that had almost broken them, and recognizing that they had bent without snapping. That was enough. That was everything.